The first Israeli to go to space had a problem that only a rabbi could solve. He would be flying around the Earth so fast that he'd see a sunrise every 90 minutes. But Shabbat is supposed to start at sundown every 7th day, which means every 10 and a half hours he'd have to break out the wine and the challah and the battery-powered space candles. It seems like a bit much, which is why the rabbi gave him an answer that might surprise you. Because Judaism has actually wrestled with questions like how to keep Shabbat at the North Pole where the sun doesn't set for months, or what to do if you're lost in the desert and totally lose track of what day it is. But here's what I really didn't expect. The rabbi's answer changed the way I see Judaism's relationship with time itself. So when does Shabbat start when you're flying thousands of miles an hour through space? It's 2003, and Ilan Ramon has a lot on his mind. He's an Israeli Air Force fighter pilot, a national hero, and he's about to become the first Israeli to go to space. I can't imagine the pressure he was under, mastering his training, memorizing emergency protocols, trying not to think about all the things that could go horribly wrong. And yet, on top of all that, Ilan Ramon chose to take on something extra. He felt the duty to represent not just his nation, but the entire Jewish people. So even though he wasn't the most religiously observant Jew on Earth, he looked for ways to honor Jewish tradition in space. He asked NASA to get him kosher space food. He hung a small mezuzah on one of the spacecraft doors. He even packed a tiny Torah that survived the Holocaust. But the trickiest thing he decided to do was observe Shabbat in space, which meant he had a question that no amount of astronaut training could answer, and that brought him to Rabbi Avi Konnikov.
Ilan Ramon turned to me with a question. How does one mark the Sabbath in space? With every 90 minutes, another sunset. Every 10 and a half hours is a Sabbath. Jerusalem, we have a problem.
Rabbi Konnikov shared Ramon's question with a panel of rabbinic leaders, and the first thing they did was look through centuries of past guidance for anything remotely similar. The question of space travel obviously never came up before, but Judaism has actually been bumping up against similar questions for generations, because space isn't the only place where nature's clockwork seems to break down. If you get far enough north on the globe, the sun acts a little funky. During winter, it can go months without rising, leaving the area in perpetual darkness. And during summer, it can go months without setting, just one super long day. So when does Shabbat start when there's no sunset? In the 1800s, a rabbi actually came up with an answer. He said if you travel to the Arctic, you should follow the same time as the place you came from. So if you're heading to the North Pole and you crossed into the Arctic Circle from Alaska, then you have to light the Shabbat candles before the sun sets in Alaska, which is pretty weird. Like, what if someone from Norway also heads to the North Pole and runs into the guy from Alaska? They're both standing there right next to each other, but they'll start Shabbat at different times because one came from Norway and the other from Alaska? Does that mean 2 Jewish astronauts on the same space shuttle can be in 2 different Jewish time zones? This seems like it can't be right, because I thought the Jewish calendar was strictly set to nature's clockwork, full of sacred moments determined by God. If we could just decide that 2 Jews in the same place should have 2 different Shabbats, that messes with my whole concept of Jewish time, because time is very important in Judaism, and the Hebrew calendar operates with the precise rhythm of a Beethoven symphony. Daily prayers tied to sunrise and sunset, monthly cycles tied to the moon, annual holidays. There are even commandments that only take effect every 7 years, and some every 50 years. In the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, Judaism teaches us to be attached to holiness in time, to learn how to consecrate sanctuaries that emerge from the magnificent stream of a year. Notice that Heschel compares time to a sanctuary, a sacred space you enter, and that's no accident, because Judaism treats certain periods of time as more than just alerts on a calendar. They're a different state of existence. When Shabbat begins, a whole set of rules kick in. No work, no writing, no cooking, no electricity. That's why Jews track time like a werewolf tracks the moon. So this Arctic Circle example really caught me off guard. But then I discovered more examples where Jewish time isn't totally fixed by nature, where things are a bit more flexible, like the calendar itself. See, in Judaism, each month tracks the cycle of the moon, but a lunar year adds up to around 11 days less than a solar year. In other words, after 12 lunar months, the Earth still hasn't quite finished going around the sun. That means over time, a lunar calendar will get out of sync with the seasons. So every few years, the ancient Israelites added an extra month to the year to pull everything back in sync. But which years had an extra month wasn't part of a fixed schedule. It was a decision made by the court based on a whole bunch of practical considerations, like the state of the barley crop, the arrival of spring, even the condition of the roads and bridges for pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. If the timing felt off, the crops weren't ready, the roads needed repairs, spring hadn't quite sprung, the court could add an extra month. Nature's clockwork set the outer limits, but within those limits, the court looked at what was best for the community. And it wasn't just when to add an extra month. Every month, Jewish leaders made a game-time decision when to start the next month, depending on when eyewitnesses spotted the new crescent moon in the sky. Basically, the ancient Jewish calendar was way more flexible than I realized. But then Rome conquered Israel and banned Jewish leaders from meeting to make these decisions. So what did the Jews do? They adopted a new fixed calendar that could run on autopilot, without having to look at the sky or make any judgment calls. When Rome cut the Jews off from nature's clockwork, Judaism didn't collapse. It took even more ownership over time itself. So Jewish time isn't a single universal clock ticking in the sky. It's tied to our community. It's controlled, at least in part, by us. And the perfect example of this is a man traveling alone through the desert who loses track of which day is Shabbat. So what should he do? Centuries ago, Jewish scholars debated this and decided that the man should count 7 days from the moment he realized he lost track, and the 7th day will be his Shabbat. So when you have nothing else to go on, no community, no witnesses, no Wi-Fi, Judaism still doesn't give up. It says you are the anchor. Start counting from yourself. Human intention becomes the foundation of sacred time when nothing else is available. Now, I don't know which is lonelier, an endless sea of sand dunes or the empty darkness of space. But at least Ramon had all the latest space gadgets to keep track of time on Earth, and that's ultimately where he found his answer. Of course, there was some disagreement among the panel of rabbis, but they all agreed that Ramon wouldn't have a new Shabbat every 10.5 hours. Just like at the North Pole, it's not about whether sunset is actually visible. It's about the 24-hour rotation of Earth. So, Ramon decided to keep Shabbat on the same schedule as the time in Houston, Texas, where he was trained for his mission. It didn't matter where he was or what he saw. What mattered was the community he came from and his desire to enter a sacred sanctuary of time. On his first Shabbat in space, Ramon couldn't pour the wine into his Kiddush cup because, no gravity. So he used a straw to drink straight from the bottle. And he read the prayer from a page he'd written out by hand. Ramon ultimately got his wish. He represented the Jewish people with class and pride. But then, tragically, he never made it home. When the shuttle was on its way back to Earth, it disintegrated in mid-air. The entire crew was lost. Instead of a welcome party, NASA spent 4 months searching across Texas for remains. Among the wreckage, they found something unbelievable: Ramon's handwritten prayer, the words he used to sanctify Shabbat in space. Somehow, it survived.